Hello, and welcome back to France Made Simple, the podcast where I demystify life in France and debunk some of the many myths that surround living here. Now, first of all, apologies for the slightly lost the plot ending to the last episode, but I could hear shrieking in the kitchen. And I think the cat had finally made it 10-0 to the cat on the octopus front. So I was slightly distracted. The other thing I'd like to comment is that is not actually an electronic tag, it's an anti-mosquito bracelet. So thank you for the person that inquired. Had I finally committed a crime against French government functionaries and been electronically tagged? No, I haven't. Often get the inclination to do something that might make me worthy of wearing an electronic tag, but I haven't done it yet. Now, this morning we're back to talking about renovation again. And this time we're talking about internal walls and layouts. Now, obviously, when you renovate a property, it invariably involves making compromises, whether those, are timescales, budgets, existing structural constraints, all of these need to be considered. And most people who are renovating, because let's face it, most of us are on a budget, we have to factor all of these into our decision-making processes when we're deciding on the layout. Now, excuse me, of course, it's entirely possible to do just about anything with your internal layout, but you just need to always be aware of the fact that large-scale alterations will increase the cost and, here is the important bit, the time taken to complete the project. And I think a lot of us underestimate how long it's going to take to complete renovation projects. And it can get super stressful when it feels like the end is never, ever going to be in sight. So time, I think, is a big thing to be taken into consideration. Having said that, many properties, if not all properties, or almost a majority, are going to benefit from internal remodeling to some extent. And the lack of internal building regulations for renovation projects in France means that this is something that virtually all property owners will be able to do. Now, this lack of regulation is a bit of a double-edged sword because many older properties will have been so hacked about over the years that new owners are pretty much forced to add or remove walls to create a more logical and usable layout, not layabout. God, more coffee, Catherine. Over the years, I've viewed numerous houses in France and visited friends in numerous properties, and I've seen some absolute horrors. I really have, family bathrooms which lead directly off from the sitting room, and bedrooms which can only be accessed through walking through other bedrooms have, shown up before now. I wouldn't say they're common features in older French properties, although the bedroom thing often is. And the last house we bought, that was the case. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, but you could only get to the 3rd bedroom by walking through bedroom number 2. So not ideal. Now, I think really and ideally, you should start by planning the new layout by looking at what currently exists and evaluating what works and what could be improved. And always remember that even if you're happy with an existing layout and have no problem having the family bathroom directly off the sitting room, should you want to sell in the future, other potential purchasers might be deterred by it. And I think the case of a bedroom accessed only via another bedroom is a perfect example. You might feel you can live with this, especially if you've got fairly small children, but it will be a red flag to any potential buyers. So with things like this, if you can address them, if it's feasible and it's not going to be expensive, I do think it's worth doing. Now, I think the next thing to do is to try to imagine what would be the ideal internal layout. Now, this ideal layout is going to be governed to a certain extent by the type and the style and the size of the property, as well as your own lifestyle and your personal preferences. So what I mean here is you may have always wanted a large square entrance hall with all the main rooms leading off it. You know, that kind of classic home that was so evocative of the sort of Georgian rectory in the home counties. But if the property in question is a Breton longère, then that's going to be tricky. So this is where compromise always comes into renovation projects. If you are in the countryside and you're living a kind of rural lifestyle and you have animals and families with small children, always benefit from a mud room, which is somewhere to deposit your coats and boots. And it almost acts as what the French call a sas, like SAS, a sort of holding zone. So the mud and wet coats and wet dogs don't get dispersed everywhere in the house. We lived in one house where you entered the property via the garage, and although it sounded bizarre, it actually worked really well, because by the time you got to the kitchen, wet dogs, muddy children had all been deposited on the way in, boots removed, coats hung up. It was a really good design. Now, if you entertain frequently, you might want even a reception hall. And if you are planning to do chambre d'hôte, B&B, you're going to have practical issues to consider, such as food storage and laundry facilities to plan into your layout. So I think it's a good idea to list all of the different ways you want to use the space inside the property, and then try to work out if this is possible. Obviously, as we said previously, everything is possible, but is it possible within your structural constraints and your budget? Now, I just mentioned structural constraints, and this is the moment where you need to really evaluate those and think about how they will affect any changes that you might want to make. Obviously, the main factor to be considered is the existence of load-bearing walls. Now, if you're not sure whether a wall is load-bearing or not, always seek professional advice before starting to remove it, she says, who frequently has not done so. Now, load-bearing walls can be partly or entirely removed, but you are going to need adequate supports, usually steel beams, and they're going to need to be put back in. The required load-bearing capacity of the steel is going to need to be calculated. So unless you are a super duper DIYer that actually knows what you're doing, semi-professional builder, I would say at this stage, get professional advice and listen to the professionals, because again, I've seen so many botched renovation jobs where people have taken out an internal wall and 3 years later there are still acro props in place because they don't really know what they need to do to keep the wall up. Now, if you're somebody like me that loves watching TV programs about property renovation, you'll know that, again, in theory, it's possible to move just about anything anywhere. And yeah, as a friend of my dad says, what's his expression? If it's a problem that money can solve, then it's not a problem. Well, that's fine if you're a millionaire like George, but for the rest of us, especially those of us renovating in France, moving anything anywhere you might fancy moving it on a whim is wholly impractical, as the costs incurred are going to be out of all proportion to any benefit gained. You know, I'm thinking things like existing openings and chimney breasts are often best left alone for this very reason, unless you really can't live with it. We did actually remove the chimney breast in our last house and relocated it to the centre of the building so that we could use that to heat the entire house. But again, my husband was a very competent DIYer, semi-professional, and knew what he was doing, but it was still a lot of work. It was worth doing, but that's not always going to be the case. So be realistic about those kind of major structural changes. Having said that, removing non-load bearing or partition walls is relatively cheap and easy to do, and this can absolutely transform your property. So I'm thinking instances like removing the walls between two small rooms to create a larger living area, or taking out narrow corridors and hallways. And this is going to open up the space in the property and improve the overall feel. So almost always worth doing. So partition walls, easy to identify because you can knock on them, knock, 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 and the sound is hollow and it's quite different to a solid wall. So once you've worked out which walls could be removed and you've thought about your ideal layout, then you can start to think about what will fit where. Now, furniture can often be moved around living spaces and bedrooms to fit the space available. You could even end up changing some of that furniture if, for example, your sofa's too big or too small, you sell a sofa, buy a bigger one. However, in kitchens and bathrooms, your eventual wall position is going to be constrained by the need to create enough space for your appliances, sinks, dishwashers, all those kinds of things. And I think at this stage, marking out the position and any new walls and doorways and appliances on the floor will give you a really good idea of what will fit where and enable you to visualize how the room will work. We did this with one bathroom because I was absolutely incapable of imagining or visualizing that we would actually have room for a bath. But when my husband drew the outline of the bath on the floor, I was like, oh yeah, okay. So the door opens there and right, okay, gotcha. Yep, let's do that. Now, obviously, you need really accurate measurements and you can use home design software to do this. And many of these types of programs are fairly simple to use. And even if you have to get a paid for version, I think it's well worth the initial outlay if you're doing a renovation and, it's a big project. And there will always be instances where you're going to have to compromise. It might just be that there's simply not quite enough space in a bathroom to have a wash basin, a large bath, a larger shower and a toilet. So, okay, all bathrooms need a wash basin, but you might have to then make that choice between installing a smaller shower, ditching the bath, or installing a separate toilet next to the bathroom. Personally, I prefer separate toilets anyway, unless you've got multiple bathrooms and extra toilets. I think it's always better to put a toilet apart from the bathroom. And all of these type of decisions are going to be affected by your structural constraints, practical stuff like the position of waste pipes and your personal preferences. And by that, I mean, if you're somebody that can't live without a bath, then obviously a bath is a higher priority than a large shower. So once you've decided on which walls are being removed and where any new partition walls are going to go in, the fun part can start. Now, demolition is hugely satisfying, but before you start, please make sure you have everything you need to hand. And this includes not just tools and equipment and extra manpower if needed. I also think that you need to remember that if it's the first time you've removed a wall, don't underestimate the amount of physical effort involved and the amount of dust and mess to be cleared up. So it's not just a question of tools and equipment. The cleanup often takes as long, if not longer, than the demolition part of the job. So make sure you have enough rubble sacks or wheelbarrows because you need to have worked out already how you're going to dispose of that rubble. Now, again, this might depend on the construction of the wall. If it's timber, the old timber could be burned or possibly reused for other projects, or you can easily dispose of that. And rubble from brick and block walls, you might be able to use that somewhere else as hardcore. But if reusing or disposing of the materials on site isn't an option, then you're going to need to get rid of it elsewhere. And plasterboard is almost certainly going to have to be taken to the local tip for disposal. So if you don't own a trailer to whack it all in, you're going to need sturdy rubble sacks to transport the waste. And you're going to need more of them than you could ever have thought possible, trust me. And if you have enough rubble to transport, I would suggest wait till it's all ready to go and then hire a trailer for a day or a half day. You can do that quite easily from lots of places these days, and anybody can tow a small trailer. So as long as you've got a tow hook on your car, you could do that. Now, once your wall's out and you've cleared the area and breathed a sigh of relief, maybe a while before you can breathe freely in the house due to the extreme dust everywhere, but that's another story. You're going to need to tackle the leftover bits, such as slightly different floor levels, broken bits of architrave, as well as fixing the hole left by the removal of the partition wall where it was attached to the other walls. And this process is known as making good. And I would like to say the time taking to complete this will vary from room to room, but reality is it will vary from person to person. Knocking down, quite easy to do. Making good, I don't know whether it's a kind of, mental break issue that people have, but it seems to take people a lot longer to put things back. It's hard, dusty and dirty work, removing and moving walls, but it's something that's often well worth doing, as changing the layout can have a huge impact for really very little cost in terms of money, but time. As I've said at the start, don't underestimate the time involved. If we're talking plasterboard, studded or timber walls, you can work, if you're reasonably fit, you could take around an hour to remove 20 square metres of wall. But brick and block walls take a lot longer due to the construction method, and the rubble is also going to take you longer to get rid of. And if you need to move services such as electric cables, water, waste pipes, obviously all of this is going to add to the timescale. Now, in terms of cost, I would say it varies according to whether the wall is structural or a simple partition wall. If the wall is just a partition wall and you're doing it yourself, then the costs are really very minimal. The only real outlay there is your petrol or diesel, which is significant at the moment, to take your rubble to the local tip, la déchetterie. But if you add steel lintels or skilled labour into the equation, it's going to increase the costs. But if you ask a general builder, a maçon, to give you a quote, un devis, that should include both the labour and necessary materials involved. So, in conclusion, I would say do proceed with caution. If in doubt, take advice. Do think out of the box. Just because the room is currently an entrance hall, it doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be combined with another area to become something else. And definitely play around with the layout before you start work. Whether it's scale drawings, 3D plans, or just drawing on the floor with chalk, that will all help. The don'ts, a bit more complicated here. Don't rush to start work. If possible, live in the property for a while before you start changing the layout. And that is why I said it's a bit complicated, because sometimes it's really, really hard to make yourself wait. And it's very tempting to start. But in the last house we owned, well, actually we still own it, we spent over a year living with the 4 doorways that went into the main kitchen before we decided finally which of the 4 to close up. And we closed them off. We closed 2 off temporarily, and that really helped with the decision-making process. If we'd have gone ahead and blocked up the first doorway that we thought was the right doorway to be blocked off initially, that would have been the wrong decision to make. So don't rush to start the work, and do try and live there for a while before you change the layout. Also, don't hesitate to ask other people's advice, because sometimes a fresh perspective really helps. They might come up with something that you just haven't thought of. And finally, don't underestimate how much dust demolition creates. Yes, please do hang dust sheet and cover doorways to minimize mess, but ideally tape them up, try and hermetically seal it. Think of the kill room in Dexter. That is what you Dexter, the TV series. That is what you ideally want to create. Obviously, this isn't always possible when you're renovating and often living in the property at the same time, but just remember that you are going to have a lot of mess to clear up afterwards. And also, I would say, don't be disheartened or don't be put off by the thought of doing something like this, because generally the results are well worthwhile. I hope that's been useful. Don't hesitate to send me any questions that you might have about property renovation in France. Been here a long time, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, renovated many, many properties, and I kind of know how it works. Thank you, as always, to our sponsors, Fab French Insurance, who will make your life as simple as Frenchly possible. And hopefully you won't need to claim on your household insurance that you've taken via Fab French Insurance when you've knocked down the wrong wall, having listened to this episode. And please, one last request, please do like or follow the France Made Simple podcast on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.